Chapter 1. The Scent of Ash. The air in the great hall tasted thick, metallic, like an unshed tear. Cora hated it. She hated the cloying sweetness of moon-petal flowers woven into garlands, their white heads drooping in the heat from so many bodies. They smelled like a funeral. And maybe it was. Her funeral. A chorus of whispers followed her, sharp and stinging like burrs clinging to her simple linen dress. Unclaimed. Wild blood. A shame for the silver moons. Each word was a tiny cut. She kept her chin high, a trick her mother had taught her. Never let them see you bleed. But oh, she was bleeding. Inside, where no one could see the mess. Elder Maeve stood by the ceremonial stone, her face a roadmap of wrinkled pity. She held the silver chalice, its contents swirling with a potion meant to amplify the mate bond. For everyone else, it promised a night of fated bliss. For Cora, it promised only a deeper humiliation. She scanned the crowd of hopeful males. Their eyes slid over her, past her, through her. They were looking for softer smiles, for more obedient spirits. They weren't looking for the storm she held behind her teeth. They definitely weren't looking for the daughter of a woman who had also dared to run. That was the real poison in her veins. The unspoken crime. Her mother's legacy was a cage. Then, Kaelin stepped forward. The pack's prized alpha. Strong, handsome, with a jaw that looked carved from granite and a soul that felt just as cold. His scent, pine and dominance, filled the hall, and the unmated females swayed toward him like flowers to the sun. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, finally landed on her. For a heartbeat, a stupid fluttering thing in her chest hoped. It was a foolish hope, a child's wish for a star. The hope died a quick death when his gaze flicked away, landing on Alara, a she-wolf with hair like spun moonlight and a smile that promised sweet, easy submission. He chose Alara. Of course he did. The whispers grew louder, turning from sharp pricks to a dull, crushing weight. It wasn't just rejection anymore. It was a public declaration, unwanted. The word echoed in the hollow space inside her. The air became thin, unbreathable. She could feel the walls closing in, the pitying stares like hands pushing her down, down, down. No, not like this. She would not be the pack's sad little tragedy. She wouldn't stay to be paired off with some pity-fuck Omega at the end of the night because the elders deemed it necessary for pack unity. Her fate would not be a consolation prize. So, while everyone watched Kaelin brush a tender kiss on Alara's cheek, Cora moved. Not with a shout or a sob. With a silence that was its own kind of scream. One foot behind the other, she backed away from the ceremonial stone. She melted into the shadows near the great oak doors, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The scent of pine and cheap celebration faded, replaced by the cool, damp smell of the forest floor calling to her. Freedom. It smelled like wet earth and decay and the promise of a life that was hers alone. She slipped through the doors, a ghost leaving her own wake. The sudden chill of the night air was a shock, a baptism. It felt real. It felt clean. As she plunged into the deep, dark woods, she didn't know that two sets of eyes had watched her go. One pair, filled with sad understanding from the shadows of the hall, and another pair, from much, much farther away, hidden, ancient, and hungry. Chapter 2. The King of Scars Cold. Everything in Roric's world was cold. The throne of polished obsidian beneath his hands felt like a block of ice. The crown on his head was a circlet of frozen metal, a constant, heavy reminder of his duty. Even the air in his fortress, high in the jagged peaks of the Blackwood territory, carried the chill of stone and solitude. He liked it that way. Cold was predictable. Cold didn't pretend to be warm and then burn you to the bone. He stared out the high-arched window, at the sea of pines that marched across his kingdom like a disciplined army. His army. His kingdom. His cage. A memory flickered behind his eyes, unwanted and sharp as a shard of glass. A flash of a silver dagger. His mother's smile, beautiful and treacherous. A lover's whisper, sweet as honey and twice as poisonous. Love is a weakness, Roric. A leash for fools. His father's last words. He'd learned that lesson in blood and betrayal. He had the scars to prove it, pale lines that mapped his skin and deeper ones that twisted around his heart. So he had built his reign on its opposite. Power, control, fear. They were honest. They were reliable. They would never stab you in the back while you slept. Alpha King. The voice was low, respectful. Darius, his beta, stood at the entrance to the throne room, his shadow long and thin in the dying light. He was the only one Roric trusted, and even that trust was a heavily guarded thing. What is it? Roric's voice was a low growl, the sound of rocks grinding together. He didn't turn from the window. A report from the Southern Border Patrol, my king. Darius stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. They found tracks. A lone wolf. Female. Roric finally turned, his golden eyes narrowing. His wolf, a restless beast he kept chained in the dungeons of his soul, stirred at the words. Female. Lone. It was unusual. No sane wolf traveled alone, especially not a she-wolf, and certainly not across his borders. His lands were not known for their hospitality. From what pack? The markings are Silver Moon, Darius replied. But she's running from them, not with them. The scent is heavy with fear and desperation. She's young. A muscle in Roric's jaw tightened. Silver Moon. A soft pack, full of rituals and traditions he'd long since abandoned for brutal efficiency. He should have felt nothing. Annoyance, perhaps. A flicker of contempt for the weakness that would cause one of their own to flee. But he felt something else. A strange pull. A low thrum of interest that had no place in his cold, orderly world. It was an anomaly, and he hated anomalies. He hated them because they were unpredictable. He'd built his entire existence on stamping out the unpredictable. It's of no concern. Our laws are clear. Trespassers are to be dealt with. Let the patrol handle it. Darius bowed his head. Of course, Alpha King. He hesitated for a moment. But the scent, the scouts said it was unusual, like wildflowers and a coming storm. Roric waved a dismissive hand, the gesture sharp and final. I don't care if she smells like the damned moon itself. She crossed my border. She is a threat until proven otherwise. He turned back to the window, his reflection a grim, solitary figure against the darkening sky. But as Darius's footsteps faded away, the words lingered in the cold air. Wildflowers and a coming storm. The beast inside him paced, its golden eyes alight with a sudden, dangerous curiosity. For the first time in a very long time, the king felt a crack in his ice. Chapter 3. Gold in the Dark Panic was a living thing. It had claws and teeth, and it was tearing its way up Cora's throat. She ran. Trees whipped past her, their branches like skeletal hands trying to grab her, to pull her back. Her lungs burned. Every breath was a ragged gasp of pine and cold, wet dirt. The sounds of her own pack had faded hours ago. But now there were new sounds. The heavy, synchronized pounding of paws. Not the familiar rhythm of the silver moons. This was different. Heavier, more deliberate. Like the hunting tread of predators who knew they had already won. They smelled different too. Not of pine and mountain flowers, but of rock and iron and something wilder. Something that made the small hairs on her arms stand up. She'd crossed a border. She knew it. The air itself felt charged, heavy with a power that felt ancient and unforgiving. A stupid, stupid mistake. Running from the cage only to find herself in the lion's den. Was this what her mother felt right before? She shoved the thought away. She wouldn't die. She couldn't. A huge, gray-furred wolf burst from the undergrowth to her left, cutting off her path. She skidded to a halt, kicking up a spray of dead leaves. Another one, this one as black as a moonless night, materialized on her right. They weren't snarling. They didn't need to. Their stillness was more terrifying than any show of aggression. It was the calm confidence of the hunter cornering its prey. There was no escape, but she was not prey. She was a wolf of the silver moon, and she would not die on her knees. A low growl rumbled in her chest, and she lowered herself into a fighting crouch, her lips pulling back from her teeth. She would take one of them with her. Maybe both. She launched herself at the gray one, a blur of defiant fury. She was smaller, but she was fast. She dodged its snapping jaws and tried to sink her teeth into its leg, but it was too strong, shaking her off like a dog shakes off water. The black wolf used the opening to slam into her side, knocking the wind from her lungs and sending her tumbling to the forest floor. Pain exploded in her ribs. Dazed, she struggled to get up, the taste of blood and earth in her mouth. And then, everything stopped. The air grew still. The two wolves that had been ready to tear her apart suddenly froze, their heads dropping in submission. A new scent cut through the forest, so powerful it made her dizzy. It was ozone after a lightning strike, dark earth after a winter rain, and a deep, musky maleness that called to something primal deep inside her soul. A shadow fell over her. She looked up. He was immense, taller than any alpha she had ever seen, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world. He wasn't in his wolf form, but he might as well have been. Power rolled off him in suffocating waves. His hair was as black as the wolf at his side, and his face was all hard angles and brutal beauty. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. They weren't blue or brown or gray, they were gold. Molten gold. The eyes of a predator king. Their gazes locked, and the world shattered. It was not a gentle click of recognition. It was a violent, soul-shaking cataclysm. Mate. The word wasn't a thought. It was a brand, seared onto her very being. She felt it in her bones, in her blood, in the sudden, desperate beat of her heart. She saw the shock echo in his own golden eyes, a flicker of disbelief, and then fury. A cold, terrifying rage. This was her fated one? This terrifying, brutal king who looked at her like she was something he wanted to conquer and destroy all at once? The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. She'd run from being unwanted, only to be fated to a man who clearly didn't want her. His jaw clenched, and the beast under his skin seemed to snarl. His wolf wanted her. The man was at war with himself. He took a step forward, and the world seemed to tremble. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones scraping together. It was a command laced with a self-loathing he couldn't hide. Take her prisoner. Chapter 4. A gilded cage. Sunlight, pale and thin, was the first thing she noticed. It sliced through a tall, narrow window, painting a single stripe of light across a room that was definitely not the forest floor. Cora blinked, her mind sluggish and thick like honey. She was lying on something impossibly soft, a bed filled with down and covered in furs. A low fire crackled in a huge stone hearth across the room, smelling of cedar and warmth. The air itself was clean, scented with dried herbs and beeswax. She pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. Every inch of her ached. She was in a bedroom fit for a queen, all dark wood, rich tapestries, and heavy, silent walls. The only thing missing was a door handle on her side. Panic, cold and sharp, finally cut through the fog. A cage. A beautiful, comfortable, warm cage. She scrambled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold stone floor. The simple linen dress she'd worn for the ceremony was gone, replaced by a soft gray tunic that felt like silk against her skin. Someone had undressed her, cared for her. The thought sent a fresh wave of violation and fury through her veins. She rushed to the door, her hands searching the heavy oak. Nothing. No latch, no knob, just solid, unforgiving wood. The window was her next hope. She dragged a heavy chair over and peered out. A sheer drop of hundreds of feet met her gaze, a dizzying fall to the jagged rocks and endless pines below. A prison in the sky. Beneath the anger, a different sensation hummed. A low, constant vibration under her skin. It was him, the Alpha King, the Bond. Even with miles of stone between them, she could feel his presence in the fortress, a deep, resonant thrum that her own wolf recognized with a terrifying sense of belonging. She hated it. She hated him. She hated this weakness fate had cursed her with. What kind of cruel joke was this, to give her a mate who looked at her with such open contempt, a mate who had stolen her freedom the very second he found her? She would not accept it. She would rather die out in the wild, alone and free, than live as the possession of a tyrant. The sound of a heavy bolt sliding on the other side of the door made her spin around, her body tensing into a defensive crouch. The door swung inward and he filled the frame. Roric. He was even larger than she remembered, a mountain of quiet, menacing power. He carried a tray with a steaming bowl and a mug. His golden eyes swept over the room, taking in the displaced chair, her defiant stance, and the fury burning in her face. He seemed completely unmoved. "You are awake," he stated. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. "You should eat. You were exhausted." "Where am I?" she snarled, the sound more wolf than woman. "Why did you bring me here?" "You are in the Blackwood fortress, my fortress," he said, setting the tray down on a small table. The food smelled rich, a stew thick with meat and herbs. Her stomach betrayed her with a loud growl. "You were on my land, unclaimed, injured. That makes you my responsibility." "I am not your responsibility," she shot back, taking a step forward. "I am not your prisoner. Let me go." He finally looked at her, truly looked at her, and the cold indifference in his eyes was somehow worse than the fury she'd seen in the forest. It was like he was looking at an inconvenient piece of property. "I cannot do that." "Why not?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Because of this. This thing between us?" "I don't want it. I reject it. I reject you." A muscle jumped in his jaw, the only sign that her words had hit their mark. He moved toward her, his steps silent and predatory. He didn't stop until he was looming over her, the scent of him, ozone and that deep, dark earth, making her head swim. His wolf was there, just beneath the surface, raging in the depths of his golden eyes. It wanted her, desperately. But the man was a fortress of his own. He leaned down, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that scraped against her soul. It was a promise, it was a curse. "You will have every comfort this fortress can offer. Food, warmth, safety," he murmured, his breath ghosting across her cheek. "But you will never have me. I will never mark you." Chapter 5. Fire and Ice 3 days. 3 days she had paced the floors of her luxurious prison cell. 3 days of seeing no one but a silent servant who brought her meals and refused to meet her eyes. 3 days of feeling the constant, maddening pull of the mate bond. A phantom limb that ached for a man she despised. Roric had not returned since his cruel promise. Yet, she felt him everywhere. His scent seemed to linger in the stone walls. His presence was a weight on the air of the entire fortress. Her wolf was a frantic thing under her skin, torn between the instinct to flee and the primal urge to seek him out. The stalemate was driving her insane. She was done waiting, done pacing, done being a good little captive. If he wouldn't let her go, she would force his hand. She'd watched the patterns of the guards from her window, a sliver of the courtyard visible if she pressed her face to the glass. They changed shifts at midday. There was a brief moment of distraction, a handful of seconds where attention was lax. It would have to be enough. She wouldn't get another chance, because planning to stay here, to slowly let this place and this bond consume her, was not an option. When the midday sun was high, she put her plan into action. The servant entered with her lunch, and as she turned to leave, Cora moved. She didn't hurt the woman, just slipped past her like a shadow, a blur of silent, desperate motion. She was in the hallway. Stone corridors branched off in a confusing maze, but she could smell the open air. She followed the scent of pine and wind, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Guards shouted behind her. An alarm bell began to toll, its deep clang echoing through the fortress. She didn't care. She was running. She was free. She burst into the main courtyard, the sudden sunlight blinding. The main gate was ahead, a massive structure of iron and wood. It was open just enough for a wagon to pass through. So close, so close. She sprinted across the cobblestones, her bare feet flying. She was 10 feet away when a wall of muscle and fury slammed into her path. Roric. He hadn't run. He had simply appeared. One moment the way was clear, the next he was there, an immovable object of pure alpha power. "Going somewhere?" he growled, his voice a low thunderclap. She didn't answer, just tried to dodge around him. He caught her arm, his grip like a steel band. The contact sent a jolt of pure electricity through her, a shocking, agonizing pleasure that made her gasp. She struggled, twisting in his grasp, but it was like fighting a mountain. He was too strong. With a frustrated snarl, he backed her up against the cold, rough stone of the courtyard wall, pinning her there with his body. The world narrowed to the space between them, the cold stone at her back, the searing, impossible heat of his chest pressed against hers. His scent was overwhelming, flooding her senses, short-circuiting her thoughts. His face was inches from hers, those molten gold eyes blazing with a fury that was matched only by the raw hunger she saw warring within them. His wolf was out, and it was done denying what it wanted. A possessive growl ripped from his throat, a sound that vibrated through her very bones. Her own wolf, traitor that it was, answered with a soft whimper, her head tilting back on instinct, baring the sensitive skin of her neck. His fangs descended, white and sharp and beautiful. He lowered his head, his breath hot against her pulse point. This was it. The mark. The final surrender. Her body trembled, caught between terror and a deep, soul-shaking desire. "Mine," his growl seemed to say. Yes, her soul seemed to answer. Then, just as his teeth were about to graze her skin, they both flinched back as if burned. Roric stared at her, his eyes wide with horror at his own loss of control. He looked shaken to his core. Cora's own breath came in ragged gasps, her hand flying to her neck, her mind reeling from how much she had wanted it, how much she had craved the very thing she was trying to escape. The raw vulnerability between them was a chasm, wide and terrifying. "My king!" A sharp voice cut through the charged silence. Darius was striding toward them, his expression grim. He stopped a respectful distance away, his eyes carefully avoiding Cora's. "Apologies for the interruption, but there is urgent news from the Whisper Wind, Alpha Valerius of the Blood Moon Pack. He knows of the Silver Moon female. He offers her sanctuary from your protection, and he challenges your claim." Chapter 6. The King's Claim. The name Valerius hung in the air like the scent of blood. It spread through the fortress faster than fire, a rumor that crackled with the promise of war. An alpha from another territory offering sanctuary to a female on Blackwood land was more than an offer. It was an insult, a challenge thrown down for all the packs to see, and Cora was the territory being disputed. In a single afternoon, she had gone from being Roric's inconvenient secret to the center of a brewing political storm. The eyes of the warriors in the fortress now followed her with a new kind of intensity. Some looked at her with suspicion, some with hunger, and some with the cold calculation of men weighing the value of a prize. She had never felt more like a trapped animal. Roric had been a ghost since their confrontation in the courtyard. He'd left her with a single, snarled order to return to her room, his face a mask of self-disgust. But now, he summoned her. A grim-faced guard escorted her not to his private study, but to the great hall. The same cavernous room with the obsidian throne. This time, it wasn't empty. It was filled with his inner circle, dozens of the biggest, most battle-scarred wolves she had ever seen. They stood in silence as she entered, their collective gaze a heavy weight. The air was thick with tension and the metallic scent of aggression. This wasn't a conversation. It was a tribunal. And she was the one on trial. He was on his throne. Not a man, but a king. He looked as if he were carved from the same cold, unforgiving stone as the mountains around them. His golden eyes found hers, and they held no trace of the fire she'd seen in the courtyard. They were flat, cold, and utterly unreadable. He did not ask her to approach. He didn't acknowledge her beyond a glance. He was performing, and his entire pack was the audience. "Alpha Valerius is a fool," Roric began, his voice booming in the hall, each word a hammer blow. "He mistakes my patience for weakness. He believes he can stick his scavenger's nose into my territory and steal what is mine." His eyes flicked to Cora, and for a moment she was nothing more than a thing, a possession. "He offers sanctuary to a stray I have taken in. He speaks of freedom for a wolf who has no claim to it while she stands on my land." Cora's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The humiliation was a hot, bitter thing in her throat. He was talking about her as if she weren't even there. He was reducing her to a piece in his game of power with this other alpha. Her pride, the very thing that had made her run in the first place, screamed for her to shout, to defy him, to tell them all she would never be his property. But she was surrounded by his loyal killers, and she knew that in this moment her voice meant nothing. He rose from his throne, a towering, intimidating figure. He descended the few steps to the main floor and began to pace before his warriors, his presence dominating the entire hall. "Valerius wants to test the borders of the Blackwood. He wants to see if the Alpha King has grown soft. We will show him his error." He stopped and turned his gaze back to Cora, pinning her in place. The entire hall held its breath. "The female is not a prize to be won," he declared, his voice dropping to a dangerous, possessive growl that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. "She is not a guest to be rescued. She is here because I allow it." He took a step towards her, his voice rising again to fill every corner of the room. "She is under my protection. Her life is mine to command. Her fate is mine to decide. Any who would seek to take her from these lands will answer to me, and they will pay in blood." A roar of approval erupted from the warriors, a deafening explosion of sound. They stamped their feet and slammed their fists on their shields. In that moment, Cora was truly and utterly trapped. He hadn't claimed her as a mate. He had branded her as his territory. It was the ultimate act of possession, a public declaration that stripped her of all choice. She hated him for it. She hated the tiny, traitorous part of her wolf that felt a savage thrill at the sheer, untamed power of his claim. But before the roar could even begin to fade, the great doors to the hall burst open. A lone wolf stumbled inside, his clothes torn, his face pale with exhaustion, and a deep, bleeding gash on his arm. He fell to his knees before the throne, gasping. "My king," he choked out. He held up a scroll, its wax seal one Cora recognized with a jolt of icy dread. It was the crest of her old pack, her father's crest. Her father, who was supposed to be dead. The messenger's eyes, wild with fear, found hers. A message for the female, from Alpha Gideon. Chapter 7. Cracks in the Stone. The name Gideon was a ghost, a dead man's name. A father she barely remembered, a fading scent of wood smoke and a deep voice humming a lullaby. And now, he was alive. The knowledge was a stone in her gut, cold and heavy. Before Cora could demand answers, Roric had the wounded messenger dragged away to the dungeons for questioning. He'd locked her back in her room, but the gilded cage felt different now. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken questions. Her desperate need to escape had changed. It had sharpened into a new, more dangerous purpose. She needed to understand. The fortress was no longer just a prison. It was the heart of a mystery, and her father, her dead father, was somehow tangled in its web. A strange kind of freedom was given to her in the days that followed. Roric allowed her to walk the inner fortress, a calculated risk she did not understand. She was always watched, of course. The guards' eyes followed her everywhere, but she could see the life of this place, the workings of the machine that Roric commanded. She saw him in the lower courtyard settling a land dispute between two grim-faced farmers. His words were sharp, his judgment swift, but it was fair. He listened to both sides, and his solution left both men grumbling but satisfied. It was not the act of a mindless tyrant. Later, she saw him in the smoke-filled armory, speaking to a warrior so young he still had the softness of a pup in his cheeks. The boy was terrified, his hands shaking as he held a new sword. Roric placed a heavy hand on his shoulder, his voice too low for her to hear, but the boy's fear seemed to lessen. He stood a little taller. These small moments were cracks in the stone image she had built of him. He was a brute, a captor, a king of ice and fury. But he was also a leader. His people weren't just afraid of him, they respected him, they trusted him. The contradiction confused her, and it made the insistent pull of the mate bond even more complicated. How could her soul cry out for a monster? And what if he wasn't a monster at all? One evening, an old servant woman named Lyra brought a warm, fur-lined cloak to her room. Her face was kind, a web of soft wrinkles around eyes that had seen too many winters. Unlike the others, she met Cora's gaze. "The nights grow cold in the mountains," Lyra said, her voice a soft, gentle rasp. "The king would not want you to catch a chill." "The king doesn't care if I live or die," Cora answered, the bitterness sharp on her tongue. Lyra gave her a sad little smile. "Oh, child, you are wrong." The old woman fussed with the cloak, draping it over a chair. "I was here when he was just a boy. I saw what they did to him. His mother, she was a beautiful poison, taught him that love was just a pretty word for a knife. He built these walls around the fortress, but he built thicker ones around his heart." She looked at Cora, her eyes full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. "He doesn't know how to be anything but a king, because being a man nearly killed him." The story settled in Cora's chest, a painful, warming thing. It didn't excuse his actions, but it gave them a shape, a reason. Lyra turned to leave, then paused at the door. Her kind face suddenly grew tight with fear. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a panicked whisper that was barely audible. "Be careful, little bird. The king has wolves outside these walls, but he has a serpent inside them. There's a traitor in this fortress, someone very close to the throne. They watch his every move. And now, they are watching you." Chapter 8. The spark and the steel Roric was a man walking on a knife's edge. Valerius was at his borders. A ghost named Gideon was sending messengers, and the greatest threat of all was sleeping under his own roof. This female, Cora, she was a mystery he couldn't solve, a temptation that frayed his legendary control, and a political nightmare. He needed to know what she was capable of. He needed to see the fire he'd only glimpsed in her eyes. He found her in the small walled garden Lyra had shown her, the only place that didn't feel like it was made of stone and secrets. He didn't speak. He simply grabbed her arm, his touch firm but not bruising, and pulled her along. She fought him, of course. She was all snarls and fury, a storm in the shape of a woman. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, trying to wrench her arm free. "To the training yard," was his only reply, his voice a low growl. "I need to know if you are anything more than a sharp tongue and a stubborn spirit." The training yard smelled of sweat, splintered wood, and damp earth. Warriors, huge and scarred, stopped their sparring to watch as their king dragged the strange silver moon female into their domain. The air crackled with their silent curiosity. Roric released her in the center of the packed dirt circle. He grabbed 2 wooden practice swords from a rack and tossed one to her. It was heavy, and she caught it clumsily. "Show me what you can do," he commanded. his golden eyes challenging her. He expected her to be unskilled, to swing the blade like a club. He expected to disarm her in seconds and finally break that infuriating pride. He was wrong. Her mother, a woman with secrets of her own, had feared the wildness in Cora's blood. She had taught her daughter things a proper she-wolf should never know: how to move, how to fight, how to survive. Cora settled into a low stance that was surprisingly steady, her grip on the sword suddenly sure. Roric's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Then he smiled. A true smile. It was a terrifying, predatory thing. "Good," he breathed. He came at her fast, a blur of motion and power. Their wooden swords met with a loud crack that echoed across the silent yard. The force of the blow vibrated up Cora's arms, but she held her ground. The fight was on. It wasn't a lesson. It was a battle. A raw, unspoken conversation. He was all power and relentless aggression. She was all speed and fluid grace. He pushed, she yielded and redirected. He attacked, she parried, and used his own momentum against him. The clash of wood on wood became a frantic rhythm, the sound of two wills locked in combat. Sweat slicked their skin. Their breaths came in ragged gasps. The other warriors faded away. The world shrank to this circle of dirt, to the sting of sweat in her eyes, to the intense, burning focus of his golden gaze. Their wolves were at the surface, reveling in the glorious, violent dance. He lunged, a move designed to finally overpower her. She dropped low, sweeping his legs out from under him. He was too well balanced to fall, but he stumbled. In that single moment of instability, she moved. She twisted, brought her sword up, and the tip of her wooden blade was suddenly resting against his throat. Silence. The entire yard held its breath. She had won. She had beaten the Alpha King. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling, her eyes locked with his. The surprise in his gaze was slowly replaced by something else, something hot and dangerous. It wasn't anger. It was respect, a raw, undeniable admiration. He was looking at her, really looking at her, for the first time. Not as a stray, not as a problem, but as an equal. That night, sleep did not come easy. When it finally did, it brought nightmares. A vision, so real it felt like a memory. Snow, a field of white, stained crimson with blood. The clang of steel and the roar of dying wolves. She saw Roric, his back to a great dying oak tree, fighting like a cornered god. And then she saw a figure emerge from the chaos of battle, his face a cruel mask she somehow knew. Her father, Gideon. In his hand was a silver dagger, the hilt bearing his crest. He moved like a snake through the fighting, and he plunged the blade into Roric's side. Roric fell. His golden eyes found hers across the battlefield, full of shock and betrayal. And she looked down at her own hands. They were covered in blood. Cora woke up with a scream caught in her throat, the cold of the dream still clinging to her bones. Chapter 9. Blood on the Crest. The dream's icy fingers were still wrapped around Cora's heart when the real bells began to ring. Not the slow, deep toll for a gathering. This was a frantic, screaming clang, a sound of pure panic that shattered the morning peace. An attack. The sound echoed the terror of her vision, and a cold dread washed over her. Valerius. He was here. He was making his move, and he had brought the bloody battlefield from her nightmare to Roric's doorstep. A guard appeared at her door, his face grim. "The Alpha King orders you to remain here. It is for your safety." He slid the heavy bolt home, locking her in. Safety? The vision flashed behind her eyes. Roric, falling in the snow. Her father's dagger, her own bloody hands. She was not safe. Roric was not safe. She would not sit here, a helpless prize in a cage, while the man from her nightmare made it a reality. She slammed her shoulder against the heavy oak door. It didn't budge. With a frustrated snarl, she looked around the room. The window. It was her only way. She ripped the heavy furs from her bed, tying them together with frantic, clumsy knots. It wouldn't reach the ground, but it might get her to a lower ledge. She would not hide. Not this time. By the time she scrambled down to the lower battlements, the fight was a living, breathing monster of chaos. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood and the savage roar of wolves locked in combat. Valerius's warriors swarmed the outer walls, their fur a mix of russet and gray against the black-furred defenders of the fortress. They fought with a desperate ferocity, their claws and swords tipped with the pale, sickly gleam of silver. Cora saw one of Roric's warriors go down, a silver-tipped arrow in his shoulder, his body convulsing as the poison did its work. Her stomach turned. This wasn't a battle for territory. This was an extermination. She ripped a sword from the limp hand of a fallen defender, the steel feeling heavy and unfamiliar after the wooden practice blade. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Find Roric!" The thought was a singular, desperate command. She pushed her way through the fray, the sounds of battle a deafening roar in her ears. She found him in the heart of the chaos, a true alpha king. He was in his human form, wielding a massive broadsword that sang a song of death with every swing. He was a whirlwind of controlled fury, a rock against which Valerius's forces broke. But even a rock could be worn down. He was surrounded. Two of Valerius's largest wolves harried him from the front, their jaws snapping, forcing him to keep his attention divided. As he parried a sword thrust from one, another warrior, moving with a serpent's stealth, crept up behind him. In his hand was a silver dagger, its tip gleaming. He raised it high, ready to plunge it into Roric's unguarded back. It was her dream. It was happening. Time seemed to slow, to stretch like warm taffy. Cora didn't think. She didn't plan. She just moved. A strange power, hot and fierce, erupted in her chest, a flood of raw energy she had never known she possessed. It sang in her blood, made her muscles feel light and impossibly strong. She crossed the 20 feet between them in what felt like a single heartbeat, her borrowed sword a silver blur. She was too late to stop the arm from descending, but she was not too late to meet it. She slammed her body into the attacker, her sword finding the soft spot under his ribs. He grunted, a wet, surprised sound, his silver dagger clattering to the stone floor. He collapsed at her feet. Roric spun around, his sword ready, his golden eyes blazing. He froze when he saw her. She stood over the dead warrior, her chest heaving, her knuckles white on the hilt of her sword. The strange, hot power was already fading, leaving her feeling weak and shaky. But for a moment, he saw it. A faint, silvery light seemed to glow in her eyes, a shimmer of ancient power that no normal wolf possessed. He stared, stunned, realizing in that instant that the runaway female he'd captured was something more, something else entirely. The tide of the battle turned, and Valerius's forces were driven back. As the silence of exhaustion and pain settled over the fortress, Darius approached the king. He held something in his gauntleted hand. It was the silver dagger the attacker had dropped. "My king," Darius said, his voice low and grim. "We found this on several of their elite warriors." He held it out for Roric to see. There, etched into the dark metal of the hilt, was a small, intricate crest. A wolf howling at a sliver of a moon. Cora's blood ran cold. She knew that mark. It was the crest of Alpha Gideon, her father. His symbol was on the weapons of the men who had just tried to kill her fated mate. Chapter 10. A Kingdom of Secrets. The silence after a battle is a hungry thing. It eats the echoes of screams and the clash of steel, leaving behind only the low sounds of pain. The air in the Blackwood fortress was thick with the smells of blood being washed from the stones and the sharp, clean scent of healing herbs. Cora was no longer just the king's prisoner. She was something else now. The warriors, their arms in slings and their faces etched with exhaustion, looked at her differently. Their eyes held a new, confusing mix of respect and fear. She had saved their king, but she had done it with a power none of them understood. She felt more alone than ever. The image of her father's crest on that silver dagger was burned into her mind, a question that had no answer. She needed one. She was done being a pawn, a mystery, a secret kept in a stone tower. Fury, clean and hot, finally burned away her fear. She found him in his study, a room that seemed carved from the heart of the mountain. Maps covered a massive oak table, and scrolls were piled high on every surface. It smelled of old leather, wood smoke, and him. That powerful, earthy scent that both terrified and called to her. He was standing over a map, his shoulders tense, the weight of his kingdom clear in his posture. She didn't wait for permission to speak. She threw the dagger onto the table between them. It landed with a loud clatter, the silver glinting in the candlelight. Her father's crest seemed to mock them. "Tell me what you know," she demanded, her voice low and shaking with a rage she didn't try to hide. "Tell me about my father, and don't you dare lie to me." Roric looked up from the map, his golden eyes unreadable. He looked from her face to the dagger, and something dark and painful flickered in their depths. "I know very little," he said, his voice a careful, controlled rumble. "Only that Alpha Gideon of the Silver Moons was said to have died in a rogue attack years ago. Clearly the rumors were wrong. And the power," she pushed, taking a step closer. "In the battle, I felt something strong. You saw it. Your men saw it. What was it?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "I have known you were different from the moment my scouts caught your trail," he finally admitted, his voice dropping. "Your scent, it carries a trace of the old magic, the kind we thought was lost to the world." "What magic?" she insisted, her heart beginning to pound. "What am I?" He turned away from her, presenting her with his broad, unyielding back. He stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his golden eyes. "I cannot tell you." "Cannot or will not," she spat, her frustration boiling over. "I am not a child, Roric. I fought in your battle. I saved your life. I have a right to know who I am, and I have a right to know why my father's crest is on the weapons of your enemies." "I am trying to protect you," he roared, spinning back to face her, his control finally snapping. The raw power that blasted from him made the very air in the room tremble. "Knowing will put a target on your back bigger than any army. It will make you a prize for every power-hungry alpha on this continent. It is a curse, not a gift. I am keeping you safe." "Safe?" she laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You call this safe? Your fortress is attacked, your men are dying, and you have no idea who to trust. Protection is just a prettier word for a cage. It's the same lie they told me back home." Their argument was a storm, a whirlwind of accusations and frustrations. It wasn't about her escape anymore. It was about the truth. Just as she was about to scream another demand, the heavy study door opened. Darius stood there, his face pale, his eyes grim. He ignored Cora completely, his focus entirely on his king. "My king," he said, his voice heavy with dread. "The interrogation of the prisoner from the battle, the one she took down. He talked. Before he died, he gave us a name, the one who opened the south gate for Valerius's men." Darius paused and looked at his alpha with an expression of deep, profound unease. "It is someone we trust. Someone in your war council." Chapter 11. The Blood of the Moon. The traitor's name, unspoken but hanging in the air, changed everything. The threat was no longer just outside the walls. It was in the very heart of Roric's kingdom, a poison in the veins. He knew, with a certainty that felt like ice in his gut, that he could no longer afford to keep Cora in the dark. A target she didn't understand was a target she couldn't defend against. He sent Darius to fetch her from her room, and when she entered the study again, the fiery anger in her eyes had been replaced by a wary, fragile tension. The mood in the room was heavy, thick with the coming revelation. Roric stood before the hearth, the firelight casting his hard features in flickering shadows. Darius stood by his side, a silent, grim pillar of support. This time, Roric didn't try to command her. He just looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a weariness that seemed ancient. "You asked what you are," he began, his voice low and rough. The truth is more complicated than you can imagine. It is a story that has been whispered as a legend for generations, a story most believe to be a myth. He told her of the Luna Argent, the moon-blooded, a legendary bloodline of alphas who were said to be descended from the spirit of the moon itself. They didn't just shift, they commanded a deeper magic. They could run faster than the wind, heal wounds with a touch, and their strength in battle was that of 10 warriors. They were magnificent, and they were feared. Generations ago, the other packs, terrified of their power, had united to wipe them out in a bloody, terrible war. It was believed that every last one of them had been slaughtered. "Your mother," Roric continued, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, "was the last one, Elara of the Moon Blood. She hid her identity, taking shelter with the Silver Moons, a quiet pack where no one would look for a queen of a dead people. She fell in love with a warrior from her guard, a man named Gideon." Cora swayed on her feet, her hand gripping the back of a chair for support. "My father. He was her sworn protector," Darius added, his voice a respectful murmur. "But he was not of her blood. He saw her power not as a sacred gift to be cherished, but as a weapon to be wielded. He became obsessed. When your mother died giving birth to you, he did not perish in a rogue attack as the Silver Moons were led to believe. He vanished. He took his most loyal followers and went into the shadows, hunting for a way to control the power he had only ever been allowed to serve. The final terrible piece of the puzzle slid into place. Roric's golden eyes held hers, and in them she saw not a captor, but a man delivering a death sentence. "There is a prophecy tied to your bloodline," he said, his voice heavy. "A daughter of the moon will rise with the power to unite the packs in a new age of peace, or shatter them into an eternity of war. Gideon doesn't want to protect you, Cora. He wants to use you. He has been building an army of rogues and disgraced alphas, promising them a share of the spoils when he conquers the territories. His plan is to force a mating between you and an alpha he can control, like Valerius. He wants to breed a new generation of soldiers, with your blood his ambition and an entire continent under his boot." The room began to spin. Every piece of her life clicked into a new, horrific picture. She wasn't a runaway. She wasn't unwanted. She was a weapon, a key, a living, breathing prophecy. The simple freedom she had craved was a child's fantasy. There was no escaping this. The weight of it, the sheer, crushing scale of it, was suffocating. She stumbled back from Roric, away from the terrible truth he had just given her. She fled his study, her mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. As she leaned against the cold stone of the hallway, gasping for breath, a single desperate thought surfaced. Alpha Valerius. His offer of sanctuary, once an insult, now sounded different. What if it was a real offer? A third option. A way to escape both the cold control of Roric's protection and the monstrous ambition of her own father. Chapter 12. The Anchor in the Storm. Pressure can forge a diamond, or it can shatter a mountain. Roric was a mountain, and he was beginning to crack. The threat of Gideon's ghost army, the sting of Valerius's public challenge, the constant maddening pull of the bond to a woman who fought him at every turn. And now, the venomous knowledge of a traitor in his own council. It was too much. The scars on his heart, left by his mother's betrayal, were tearing open again. Control was the only thing he had ever been able to rely on, and it was slipping through his fingers like fine sand. He sought release in the only way he knew how. Violence. He was in the training yard, a whirlwind of brutal motion. He fought his own warriors, not with the controlled skill of a teacher, but with a reckless, punishing ferocity. One by one, his best fighters were thrown to the dirt, bruised and battered. There was no strategy in his movements, only rage. His control, the iron discipline that had defined his entire reign, finally snapped. A guttural roar, more beast than man, was ripped from his throat. The gold in his eyes bled away, replaced by a burning, furious crimson. The berserker rage, a curse of the Alpha Kings, a storm of pure, undiluted fury that consumed everything, including reason. He no longer saw his warriors. He saw only enemies, threats, betrayers. They fell back in terror, scrambling to get away from the walking hurricane of destruction that their king had become. He was a force of nature, and he was going to tear his own fortress apart. The alarm bells began to shriek, a desperate cry for help. Cora heard them from the gardens and her heart seized. She ran, following the sounds of shouting and splintering wood. She reached the training yard to a scene of pure chaos. Warriors were pressed against the walls, their faces pale with fear. In the center of the yard was Roric. He was a monster cloaked in the skin of her mate, a creature of raw, untamed power, lost to a red haze of pain and fury. "Stay back!" one of the guards yelled at her. "He'll kill you! He doesn't know who you are!" But he was wrong. She looked past the monster. She saw the man, drowning in an ocean of his own pain. The bond between them wasn't a gentle hum anymore. It was a raw, agonizing scream. She knew with a certainty that defied all logic that she was the only one who could reach him. She ignored the shouts, the warnings. She walked out onto the dirt of the training yard, into the eye of the storm. He turned on her, a snarl ripping through the air. The red in his eyes was terrifying. But she didn't flinch. She kept walking toward him, her steps calm and steady. She didn't reach for her power. She didn't reach for a weapon. She used the one thing he had never known: gentleness. "Roric," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the chaos. "It's me. Look at me." The berserker hesitated. The storm in his eyes faltered for just a second. He was still growling, his body tense, but he had heard her. "You're not alone in this," she continued, her voice a soothing balm on his raw soul. She was only a few feet away now. "I'm right here. Come back." She reached him. The air around him was electric with rage. Slowly, she lifted her hand and placed it flat against his chest, right over his pounding heart. The contact was like a lightning strike. A shudder racked his entire body. He gasped, a ragged, painful sound. The burning red in his eyes flickered, then receded, like a dying fire. The molten gold flooded back, confused and full of pain. The strength seemed to pour out of him, and the great, powerful Alpha King collapsed against her, his full weight pressing her into the dirt. He was not a king. He was not a monster. He was just a man, utterly spent, clutching her arm like a drowning man clings to a raft. His anchor. Later, after she had helped him back to his rooms, Darius appeared. His face was a stone mask of grief, but his eyes were filled with a terrible resolve. He looked at his king, who sat slumped in a chair, still shaken. "I have dealt with the traitor," Darius said, his voice heavy as a tombstone. Roric looked up, his own eyes hollow. "Who was it?" Darius met his gaze and delivered the final devastating blow. "It was Lycan, my brother, your second in command." Chapter 13. The King of Scars. The fortress was wounded. The physical betrayal of Lycan, Roric's second, had been cut out like a cancer, but a phantom pain remained. A heavy, suspicious silence had fallen over the stone halls. Roric had retreated behind a wall of ice thicker and colder than any he had built before, but the berserker rage had changed him. It had shown him the terrifying edge of his own control, and it had shown him the one person who could pull him back. Cora. She was not a weakness. She was his anchor. And he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he could not face the coming storm without her, not just as an ally, but as a true partner. And that required the one thing he had never given anyone: trust. He found her in the library, a place she'd discovered that smelled of dust and forgotten stories. He didn't speak, just held out his hand. His eyes were not the eyes of a king, but of a man asking for something he wasn't sure he deserved. Hesitantly, she placed her hand in his. His skin was warm, calloused, and he led her from the library, through the fortress, to his private chambers. A place no one but Darius was ever allowed to enter. The room was not what she expected. It was the room of a soldier. A simple bed, a desk with a single candle, and a weapon rack. The only personal item was a small, tarnished silver locket on the bedside table. He stopped in the center of the room and released her hand. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words. After the battle, you asked what you are, he said, his voice a low rumble. Now I will show you who I am. With a slow, deliberate movement, he pulled his tunic over his head. Cora's breath caught in her throat. His chest and back were a roadmap of pale, silvery scars. A life lived in violence. He turned, showing her his back. This one, he said, his finger tracing a jagged line near his shoulder, was from a blood moon raid when I was 16. A wild beast that wandered too far down the mountain. He spoke of them calmly, as if they were simple facts of his life. Then he turned back to face her. He took her hand and placed it over his heart. Beneath her palm, she could feel his steady, powerful heartbeat, and she could feel a thin, raised line of scarred tissue. It was different from the others. Finer, more deliberate. This one, he whispered, his voice cracking for the first time, was a gift from my mother. He told her everything. The story of a beautiful, ambitious queen and her lover. The plot to kill her son, the true heir, in his sleep. He spoke of waking up to a searing pain in his chest and seeing his own mother holding a silver dagger, her eyes cold and without remorse. He had survived because his wolf, for the first time, had erupted with a strength he didn't know he possessed. He had been forced to kill her lover. His mother had been banished, her name erased from their history. He was completely vulnerable, showing her the deepest, most poisoned wound he carried. He expected to see pity in her eyes, or perhaps fear. But Cora looked at him, and she saw a reflection of her own pain. A life of being used, of being betrayed by those who should have protected her. Without a word, she stepped closer. She reached up and gently, so gently, traced the thin silver scar over his heart. Her touch was not one of pity. It was one of understanding. A silent message that said, I see you. I know this pain. Their bond, once a thing of fate and fire, softened into something else entirely. Something real. A sharp knock at the door shattered the fragile peace. A guard entered, his face pale, dragging a captured rogue behind him. My king. He was caught near the west wall. He carries a message for the female. The rogue held out a small, dark crystal. It pulsed with a faint, ugly light. Roric took it, and the crystal flared to life. An image flickered in the air between them, the face of a handsome, cruel-looking man. Alpha Gideon, her father. His cold eyes found Cora's. Daughter, his voice echoed slick and cold. Your playtime is over. Come to me and embrace your destiny, or stay with that broken king in his stone pile and watch it all burn to ash. Chapter 14. The Voice of the Queen. Gideon's threat was not a private message. It was a poison dart aimed at the heart of the fortress. Within hours, the words had spread like a plague. The runaway's father is the enemy. Will she betray us? The warriors, already on edge from Lycan's treason, now looked at Cora with open suspicion. The fragile respect she had earned in battle was dissolving into fear. How could they trust the daughter of the man who promised to burn their homes and kill their families? She could feel their doubt like a physical weight, a cold wall of mistrust that separated her from everyone. Roric was preparing for the coming war, his time consumed in war councils and strategy meetings. But Cora could see the strain on him. He was leading a pack that was beginning to fracture from the inside. She saw it in the mess hall, where wolves would go silent when she walked past. She heard it in the whispers that died the moment she turned a corner. She knew a fortress divided by suspicion was a fortress already lost. She could stay in her room, a silent, mysterious figure, and let their fear fester. Or she could face it. The girl who had run from her own pack, who had hidden from her own destiny, was gone. In her place was a woman who was tired of being defined by other people's plans and fears. She had to choose, and everyone had to see her choose. She walked into the great hall, her steps sure and steady. The war council was in the middle of a heated argument, their voices echoing off the high stone ceiling. They all stopped and turned as she entered, their faces a mixture of surprise and hostility. Roric was at the head of the great table, looking exhausted, his face carved from granite and grief. She did not wait for him to speak. She walked to the center of the room, into the heart of the wolf's den, and she met their glares without flinching. "My father is a monster," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with a power that made them all fall silent. "He speaks of my destiny, but the only destiny he wants for me is to be a broodmare for his ambitions. He is obsessed with a power he does not understand and a bloodline he does not possess. He would see this entire continent burn just to warm his hands on the flames of his own ego." She turned from the council and faced the grim-faced warriors who stood guard along the walls. "He offers you fire and death. He promises you ruin. He calls your king broken." Her eyes found Roric's, and for the first time in front of his men, she gave him a look of unwavering loyalty. "I have seen the heart of your king. I have seen his scars. He bleeds for his people. He fights for his home. He knows the sting of betrayal because he has put his trust in those who would see him fall." She took a deep breath, her voice rising with a passion that came from her very soul. "My father believes I am his weapon. He is wrong. I am not his pawn. I am not his prize. And I am not a helpless female to be claimed. I choose to stand here. I choose to stand with Roric. I choose to stand with the Blackwood pack." A silvery light, faint but undeniable, began to shimmer in her eyes. "I am a daughter of the moon, and I swear to you, my magic will be your shield in the coming battle. My blood will defend these walls." The hall was utterly silent for a heartbeat. Then, one of the older warriors, a man with a face like a scarred battlefield, slammed his fist over his heart and roared her name. "Cora!" The cry was picked up by another, and then another, until the entire hall was a deafening explosion of sound, a unified chorus of loyalty that shook the very foundations of the fortress. She had done it. She had healed the rift. She had become their queen. At the very peak of the roar, the great doors crashed open. A scout, breathless and wild-eyed, stumbled into the room. He collapsed at the foot of the throne, gasping for air. "My king! They are here! An army! Marching through the northern pass, thousands of them. I saw their banners, the Blood Moon Pack, and the crest of Gideon." Chapter 15. The Promise in the Silence. The night before a great battle has its own sound. It is not silence. It is the low hum of 1,000 souls preparing to meet their gods. It's the whisper of a whetstone on steel, the murmur of a final prayer, the soft clink of armor being checked and rechecked. The air over the Blackwood fortress was thick with this sound, a heavy blanket of unspoken fear and grim determination. Below the battlements, a new city had appeared in the valley, a sprawling camp of enemy fires that glittered like a field of fallen, malevolent stars. There were so many. Too many. Cora stood beside Roric on the highest parapet, the cold night wind whipping her hair across her face. All the walls between them, all the arguments and denials had been burned away by the fires in the valley below. They were no longer king and captive, alpha and runaway. They were simply a man and a woman, standing on the edge of the world, facing the dawn that promised to be their last. The bond between them was no longer a confusing pull or a spark of anger. It was a roaring fire in the center of their beings, a desperate, undeniable need to feel, to touch, to be real in the face of annihilation. "I am afraid," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. It was the first time she had ever said those words to him. He didn't answer right away. He just reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His hand was a warm, solid anchor in the terrifying darkness. "So am I," he finally said, his own voice rough with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I am not afraid of dying. I have faced that 100 times. I am afraid of losing you." She turned to face him, the flickering torchlight catching the raw sincerity in his golden eyes. This was the real Roric. Not the cold king on his obsidian throne, but the man who had shown her his scars, the man who had collapsed into her arms, the man who was her mate. He lifted his free hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his touch sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. The world seemed to fall away. There was no army below. There was no coming war. There was only him. He lowered his head, and his mouth found hers. The kiss was not soft or tentative. It was a desperate, hungry claiming. It was the culmination of every stolen glance, every harsh word, every moment of shared pain. It was a promise of life and a defiance of death. It tasted of fear and hope and the cold night air. He broke the kiss only to lift her effortlessly, setting her on the stone ledge of the battlement so they were face to face. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against his chest. His mouth moved from her lips to her jaw, and then to the sensitive skin of her neck. A soft gasp escaped her. His fangs, sharp and white in the torchlight, descended. This was it. The mark. The final, irrevocable sealing of their souls. There was no denial this time, no fear of losing herself. There was only a profound sense of coming home. She tilted her head, offering herself to him completely. A low, mournful sound echoed from the valley. A single, solitary war horn. It was a signal from the enemy camp, a promise of the blood that would be shed with the rising sun. The sound shattered the spell. They pulled apart, their breath misting in the air between them, the reality of their situation crashing back in with brutal force. He was about to mark her, to tie her to him forever on the eve of a battle that would most likely claim them both. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closing for a moment. His voice, when he spoke, was a raw, ragged promise that was more sacred than any bite could ever be. "This is not the time," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "Not in the shadow of death. When we survive this, not if, when, you're mine, and I am yours, completely." Chapter 16. The field of red dawn broke like a bloody wound on the horizon. The battle began not with a heroic charge, but with a guttural roar from 10,000 throats, a wave of sound that crashed against the fortress walls. The enemy army surged forward, a tide of fur and steel. Cora fought near the main gate, a borrowed sword in her hand, the strange, silvery power of her bloodline singing in her veins. It was a wild, untamed thing, a confusing storm of sensation. She could feel the fear of the young warrior to her left, the grim determination of the veteran on her right. She felt the life, the spirit of the Blackwood pack, and she fought to defend it with a ferocity that stunned everyone around her. Roric was the heart of the battle, a whirlwind of death and destruction. He moved like a vengeful god through the enemy ranks, his broadsword a blur of silver. For every one of his warriors that fell, he took 3 of the enemy with him, but even a god can be worn down by a relentless tide. Gideon's forces were vast, a seemingly endless supply of rogues and mercenaries who fought with the desperation of wolves with nothing to lose. Then came the diversion. A huge explosion rocked the western wall, a gout of black smoke and fire. It was a clear attempt to breach their defenses. Roric, seeing the flank beginning to crumble, had no choice. With a roar of command, he rallied his personal guard and charged toward the breach, leaving the main gate under the command of Darius. It was the opening Gideon had been waiting for. They came out of the chaos, moving with a speed and silence that was unnatural. An elite unit of Gideon's personal guard. They weren't trying to kill her. They surrounded her in a fluid, inescapable circle, their movements perfectly coordinated. Silver nets, weighted and cruel, flew through the air. One caught her legs, sending her tumbling to the ground. Another tangled her arms. The silver burned her skin, sapping her strength, making the wild magic in her blood fizzle and die. She was their only target. She was the prize. Through the tangled mesh of the net, she looked across the churning battlefield, her eyes searching desperately for Roric. She found him. He had seen. He was fighting his way back toward her, his face a mask of primal fury. But at that exact moment, Alpha Valerius, his cruel face split by a triumphant grin, intercepted him. The two alphas crashed together in a storm of steel. As Cora struggled against the burning chains, her eyes met Roric's. He saw her surrounded by his enemy's most elite soldiers. He saw her for a split second go limp with shock and pain. From his perspective, across a field of blood and bodies, it didn't look like a capture. It looked like a surrender. It looked like she was going with them. "Cora!" he roared. It was not a call. It was a sound of pure, heart-shattering agony, a sound of ultimate betrayal. The warriors dragging her didn't hesitate. They pulled her back, deeper and deeper into the enemy ranks. The last thing she saw was Roric, locked in a deadly battle with Valerius, his beautiful golden eyes filled with a heartbroken rage that would haunt her forever. He thought she had betrayed him. Chapter 17. The Architect of Pain. The chaos of the battlefield faded, replaced by the muffled sounds of distant fighting and the heavy, suffocating silence of Gideon's command tent. The silver chains that bound her to a wooden post felt like they were forged from ice and fire, burning her skin and leaching the strength from her bones. Her father stood before her, not with the warmth of a long-lost parent, but with the cold, assessing gaze of a master craftsman admiring his finished work. He was handsome, his features a crueler, harder version of her own, but his eyes were empty of everything but a chilling, obsessive ambition. "Do you have any idea how long I have waited for this day?" he began, his voice smooth and pleasant, a terrifying contrast to the carnage happening just outside the tent. "To see my masterpiece finally complete." "You're a monster!" she spat, the words weak. He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "I am a visionary. You are merely the clay." He began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. He told her everything. He spoke of her mother, not with love, but with a clinical detachment, describing her power as a wasted resource. He confessed that he had not saved her from the silver moons. He had orchestrated her misery. He had sent whispers to the elders, fueling their fear of her wild blood. He had arranged for her to be scorned, to be humiliated, to be made to feel so utterly unwanted that her only choice would be to run. "Every step you have ever taken, my dear daughter, has been on a path I laid for you," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Your pain, your loneliness, your desperate clawing need for freedom, I cultivated it all. I needed you to be strong but wounded, proud but broken. I needed you to run right into the arms of the one man on this continent whose heart was as famously closed as your own, the last of the Blackwood alphas." The truth was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Her escape, the one act she thought had been her own choice, was nothing but another move in his sick game. "The fated bond," Gideon continued, his eyes gleaming with mad triumph. "So rare, so powerful. I knew it would ignite between you. I counted on it. I wanted you to get close to him. I wanted you to feel the pull. I wanted you to give him a taste of hope, just before I ripped it all away. A broken heart is a far more effective weapon than any sword. First, I will break his spirit. Then, I will break his body." Her entire life, every feeling, every decision had been a lie. She was not a person. She was a project, a tool, carefully shaped to inflict the maximum amount of pain on her own mate. The deepest wound of her soul, the fear that she was just an unworthy pawn, had been ripped open, and her father was the one holding the bloody knife. He smiled, a terrible, final kind of smile. "And now, for the final act, you get to watch him die, knowing he believes you betrayed him. A perfect, tragic ending, don't you think?" He swept aside the tent flap, revealing the battlefield. Through the opening, she could see him. Roric, wounded, bleeding, but still fighting like a cornered lion. Gideon drew his own blade, its edge gleaming in the grim light. He was going to kill him. And she was chained, powerless to stop it. Chapter 18. The King of Nothing. The world had gone silent. The roar of battle, the screams of the dying, the clash of steel, it all faded into a dull, gray hum in Roric's ears. The bond, the fiery, vibrant connection to Cora that had become the center of his universe, was gone. In its place was a hollow, aching void, a wound far deeper than any sword could make. She chose him. She left me. Betrayed. The words were a relentless poison, pumping through his veins, sapping his strength, turning his heart to stone. He was fighting on instinct alone, a mindless, savage thing. Valerius was in front of him, his lips curled into a sneer, his words sharp and twisting in the wound. She chose the winning side, Blackwood. Her father offered her a kingdom, not a cage. Did you really think a creature of the moon would ever belong to a king of shadows? Each word was a hammer blow, reinforcing the old, bitter lesson his mother had taught him. Love is a leash for fools. He had let himself be a fool. He had opened his heart, just a crack, and she had shoved a dagger into it. It was his mother's betrayal all over again, but 1,000 times worse. His movements grew reckless. He no longer cared about defending himself. He only cared about destruction. He lunged, leaving his side exposed. It was a mistake a pup wouldn't make. Valerius's silver-edged sword took advantage of the opening, slicing deep into Roric's ribs. A white-hot agony flared through him, but it was nothing compared to the cold, dead emptiness in his soul. He staggered back, falling to one knee. The world tilted, the gray sky seeming to spin. His warriors, his loyal Blackwood pack, saw their alpha fall. They roared, trying to form a protective circle around him, a living wall of fur and steel. But the enemy was everywhere, a relentless tide of bodies that crashed against them, overwhelming them. It was hopeless. The battle was lost. Through the haze of pain, Roric looked across the battlefield toward Gideon's command tent. He couldn't see her, but he could picture her in his mind, standing beside her father, her face calm, having chosen power and victory over him. The last of the fight drained out of him. He had lost his mate. His kingdom was burning. The traitor who had opened his gates was a man he had called brother. He had nothing left to fight for. The Obsidian King was now the king of nothing. He let his sword fall from his numb fingers, its clang on the bloody ground a sound of final surrender. He closed his eyes, waiting for the blow that would end it all. He was alone, utterly and completely alone. Chapter 19. The moon's embrace chained, powerless, forced to watch through the tent flap as the man her soul screamed for fell to his knees. The bond between them, once a roaring fire, was now a flickering, sputtering candle flame in a hurricane. He was dying. Cora felt his life fading, and with it, her own. Despair was a cold, deep ocean, and she was drowning in it. Her father's victory was complete. He had not only defeated an army, he had shattered a soul, her soul. But in the absolute bottomless depth of that despair, something else sparked. It was not hope. It was rage, a cold, pure, diamond-hard fury. All the pain, all the manipulation, all the years of feeling like a worthless pawn in someone else's game. It all burned away. The fear was gone. The hurt was gone. The girl who ran was gone. In the ashes, something new and terrible and beautiful was born. She was the daughter of the moon. She was the last of a bloodline of queens. And she would not be his tool. She would not be his victim. For the first time in her life, she made a choice. Not to run, not to hide, but to be. She stopped fighting the power inside her. She stopped fearing it. Instead, she opened the floodgates and let it surge. She called to the magic in her blood, to the ancient legacy of her mother. The silver chains that bound her, the metal meant to be her weakness, began to hum. A soft, silvery light started to glow from her skin, tracing the lines of the cruel metal. The chains grew hot, not with fire, but with a pure, raw energy that was pouring out of her. They glowed white-hot, then turned to liquid, dripping to the dirt floor like tears of molten starlight. She was free. Her eyes, when she lifted her head, were no longer the color of the forest. They were solid silver, glowing with an inner light. Two of Gideon's guards, alerted by the strange light, burst into the tent. They saw her standing there, unbound, and they charged. She did not move like Cora anymore. She moved like the wind. She was a blur of motion, a dance of deadly grace. She didn't kill them, she didn't need to. A touch, and they crumpled, their bodies locked in a magical stupor. She was a storm, beautiful and terrifying. The architect of pain had created his own destruction. She slipped out of the tent, a ghost in the chaos of the battle's aftermath. The bond with Roric, that fragile, flickering thread of light, was still there. He was alive, barely, but alive. Every instinct, every fiber of her being, every drop of the ancient blood that now sang in her veins, focused on a single, all-consuming purpose. It was not a thought. It was a vow, an oath sworn to the moon and the stars and the broken man who held her heart. I am coming for you. I will save you. Chapter 20. The Queen's Rally. The Blackwood pack was broken. The battle was lost. Those who had survived the slaughter had scattered, melting into the shadows of the forest that had once been their stronghold. They were a pack without an alpha, a body without a heart. Defeat was a bitter poison, and they were all dying from it. In a hidden ravine, shielded by waterfalls and ancient pines, Darius tried to hold the shattered remnants of their people together. He moved among the wounded, his face a mask of grief, his own hope a dying ember. They had lost. It was over. A figure appeared at the mouth of the ravine, cloaked and silent. Instantly, the survivors were on their feet, their swords drawn, their growls echoing in the small, damp space. Their grief had curdled into suspicion and anger. "The traitor returns," one of them spat, his eyes filled with hate. The figure did not flinch. She simply pushed back her hood. It was Cora. Her face was pale and streaked with grime, but her eyes glowed with a soft, silvery light. She was not the same woman they had seen before the battle. The lost, defiant runaway was gone. In her place stood a queen. "I have not betrayed you," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with an authority that made them pause. "I was a prisoner, just like our king." She told them everything. She told them of Gideon's monstrous plan, of his years of manipulation, of how he had engineered every moment to lead to this one. She told them that Roric had fallen believing she was a traitor, his heart broken by a lie her father had carefully crafted. She looked at their tired, hopeless faces, and she did not give them a command. She gave them a choice. "You can stay here," she said, her voice softening. "You can mourn your dead and accept your defeat. No one would blame you. You have fought like lions, but your king is not dead. He is a captive, and I will not abandon him." She looked from one warrior to the next, her silver eyes meeting theirs. "My father broke your pack. He broke your king. He will not break me. I am going back for him. I may go alone, but I am going." A strange thing happened. The silver light in her eyes seemed to pulse, and the weary wolves felt a warmth spread through them. It was not just her words. It was her power. The magic of her blood was not just for fighting. It was for inspiring. It was the power of a true alpha, a true leader. They could feel her sincerity, her unwavering resolve, through the bonds of the pack. She was offering them not a victory, but a cause, a chance to die for something that mattered. Darius, his face filled with a new, fierce hope, was the first to move. He knelt before her in the damp earth. My queen, he said, his voice thick with emotion. One by one, the other warriors followed, sinking to one knee. They were no longer a scattered, broken remnant. They were an army again, small, battered, but with a fire in their hearts. Cora looked at the kneeling wolves, at her impossible, loyal army. Her eyes hardened with resolve. Now, she said, her voice the sound of ringing steel, we take back our king. Chapter 21. Two halves of a soul. They moved through the enemy camp like whispers of death. Cora's power was their shield, a strange silvery mist that seemed to cloud the eyes and dull the senses of the sentries they passed. Her small, desperate army did not fight the whole camp. They had only one target. She could feel him, his life force a weak, stubborn ember in the heart of the sprawling enemy force. He was in a large tent, guarded by Valerius's personal guard, the tent of a victor. They struck with the speed and fury of a mountain storm. Before the guards could even raise an alarm, they were overwhelmed, silenced by the grimly efficient warriors of the Blackwood. Cora swept aside the tent flap and entered. The air inside was thick with the smell of blood and bitter herbs. Roric was lying on a cot, his face pale as death, his breathing shallow. The silver wound in his side was ugly, festering, and standing over him, a smug, triumphant look on his face, was Alpha Valerius. The little moon witch, Valerius sneered, turning from his captive. Come to surrender to the winning side? I've come to take what is mine, Cora answered, her voice deadly calm, her silver eyes blazing. The fight was brutally short. Valerius was a powerful alpha, but he was arrogant, and he had never faced anything like her. She did not fight like a wolf. She moved like starlight, her blade a blur, her power a tangible force that seemed to slow his movements and predict his attacks. She disarmed him, her sword at his throat before he even realized he had lost. She did not kill him. He is not mine to kill, she said, her voice cold. He belongs to the king. She rushed to Roric's side. He was barely conscious, delirious with pain and poison. His eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on her face. The agony of his perceived betrayal was still there, a raw, open wound in his gaze. You, he whispered, his voice a broken rasp. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Words were not enough to heal this. Instead, she placed both of her hands over the terrible wound in his side. She closed her eyes and let her power, the magic of her ancestors, flow from her into him. It was not the raw, destructive force she had used to escape. This was different. It was warm, healing, a pure white light. And with it, she sent everything else, the truth, her fear, her loyalty, her desperate, aching love. She poured her very soul into him through the bond. He gasped, his body arching in pain, and then, in relief. The cold, empty void in his chest, the space where she had been, was suddenly flooded with warmth. He felt her truth, saw the events through her eyes, understood the depth of Gideon's monstrous manipulation. He knew. She hadn't betrayed him. She had come back for him. She had crossed a field of fire and death to save him. The sounds of shouting outside the tent grew louder. The entire camp was now awake, converging on their position. They were trapped. He gripped her hand, his strength already beginning to return. His golden eyes, now clear and full of a love that stole her breath, met hers. They were together, but they were surrounded, about to be overwhelmed. Together, then, he said, his voice no longer broken, but filled with the iron of his will. Together, she replied, a fierce smile on her face. Chapter 22. The King and Queen of the Moon trapped. Back to back in the heart of the enemy camp, they were an island in a sea of snarling wolves. But they were not afraid. The cold void of despair was gone, replaced by the blazing, incandescent fire of their bond. They were two halves of a single soul, and they would face the end together. The tent flap was ripped aside, and Gideon entered. He was flanked by a pale, grim-faced Valerius. Cora's father surveyed the scene, his lips curled in a triumphant smirk. He looked at Roric, bleeding and barely standing, and then at Cora, defiant and glowing with a faint, silvery light. "Well, daughter," Gideon said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your little rescue attempt was admirable, I suppose, but it ends now. Look at him. You chose a half-dead king over a god." "I chose my mate," Cora answered, her voice ringing with a power that made the very air hum. "Then you will die with him!" Gideon roared, and he charged. The final battle was a storm of fury and desperation. Roric, weak but filled with a new fire, met Valerius's attack. Their swords clashed, a desperate, grinding song of hatred. Cora faced her father. It was a battle of light against shadow. He was strong, far stronger than a normal wolf, his movements fueled by some dark ambition. He knew how to fight her, how to anticipate the surge of her magic. He pressed her back, his blade a blur of dark steel. "You are nothing without me," he screamed over the clang of their swords. "I created you. I shaped your pain. Your power is mine to command." He broke through her guard, the pommel of his sword slamming into her ribs, sending her stumbling back toward Roric. She saw Roric falter. Valerius had reopened the wound in his side. He was fading. They were losing. In that moment of absolute desperation, as her father raised his sword for the killing blow, Cora made her final choice. She was not a weapon. She was not a prize. She was a queen, and she would not lose her king. With a cry that was both a war cry and a declaration of love, she didn't attack her father. She launched herself at Roric. She grabbed his face in her hands and kissed him, a fierce, desperate kiss in the heart of the battle. It was a kiss of fire and fate and absolute certainty. Then she pulled back, her silver eyes blazing into his golden ones, and she sank her fangs into the side of his neck. The mark. It was not a bite of possession. It was a gift. A torrent of her lunar magic, pure and white-hot, flooded into him through the bond. A wave of power so immense it threw Gideon and Valerius back. Roric roared, his body arching as her magic poured into him, healing his wound, fueling his muscles, setting his very soul alight. The gold in his eyes flared, now shot through with shimmering silver. He was whole again. He was more. He turned to Valerius, no longer a wounded king, but a god of vengeance. The fight was over in seconds. Cora faced her father. The power of their completed bond surged between her and Roric, a tangible, humming force. Gideon stared at them, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had tried to use their bond as a weapon to destroy them, and instead it had become his own undoing. They came at him together, a symphony of silver and gold, of sun and moon, of two ancient bloodlines united. He was a master manipulator, but he could not fight fate itself. In the end, as Roric held him down, it was Cora who picked up the fallen silver dagger. She looked into the eyes of her creator, the architect of all her pain, and she drove the blade home. She had chosen. Chapter 23. The Price and the Prize. The death of Gideon was like the cutting of a puppet master's strings. His army, a patchwork of rogues and mercenaries held together only by the force of his will and the promise of power, collapsed into chaos. Seeing their leader fall, they broke and ran. The battle was over. The victory was absolute. In the sudden ringing silence of the medical tent, surrounded by the bodies of their enemies, Cora and Roric stood alone. The adrenaline of the fight, the glorious surging power of their completed bond began to fade, leaving behind a deep, profound exhaustion. The silver light in Roric's eyes receded, leaving only his pure, molten gold. The supernatural strength that had filled him drained away, and the true cost of the battle hit him all at once. His wounds, though magically sealed, had taken their toll. His body, pushed far beyond its limits, finally gave out. He swayed on his feet, a low groan escaping his lips, and collapsed. Cora caught him, her own strength barely enough to soften his fall. He was burning with fever, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The magic had saved his life, but his body still had to pay the price. She gently lowered him to the ground, cradling his head in her lap. The warrior queen who had faced down an army was gone. In her place was a woman looking at the man she loved, her heart aching at his pain. The fierce, wild side of her magic had won the war. Now, she needed the other side of her gift, the side she had never known she possessed, the power to restore. She placed her hands on his chest, over the newly healed wound. She closed her eyes, shutting out the carnage around them, and focused on the steady, warm hum of their bond. She didn't call on the fire and fury. She called on the quiet, gentle light of the moon. A soft, pearlescent glow emanated from her hands, sinking into his skin. It was not a raging torrent of power this time. It was a slow, steady, peaceful river. She poured her own strength, her own life force, into him. She could feel his fever cool, his ragged breathing deepen and grow steady. She felt the torn muscles knitting back together, the last of the silver poison being cleansed from his blood. As she healed his body, the bond between them opened up in a way it never had before. It was no longer just feelings and instincts, it was everything. She saw his life, not as a story he had told her, but as a memory of her own. She felt the sting of his mother's betrayal, the crushing weight of his crown, the lonely, echoing silence of his stone fortress. She felt his profound isolation, and her heart broke for the lonely king. And he, in his feverish state, saw her. He lived her years of being the unwanted child. He felt the sting of the whispers, the humiliation of the ceremony, the desperate flight into the woods. He felt her terror in his fortress, her defiance in the training yard, her fierce, protective love when she had stood before his warriors and claimed them as her own. All the walls were gone. All the secrets were known. There was only a deep, quiet, and complete understanding. Their souls were no longer just fated. They were forged into one. Chapter 24. A Kingdom of Two. Spring came to the Blackwood Mountains, a slow, gentle thawing of the frozen land. New green shoots pushed their way through the last of the melting snow, a quiet promise of renewal. The fortress, scarred but not broken, was filled with the sounds of rebuilding. The mood of the pack was no longer grim, but hopeful. They had survived the winter. They had survived the war. They had earned the spring. In the great hall, finally repaired, the entire Blackwood pack was gathered. Roric and Cora stood before them on the dais where the obsidian throne had once sat. The throne was gone. In its place stood two simpler, carved wooden chairs. They stood side by side, hand in hand, equals. The scars of the battle had faded, but the changes in them were permanent. The cold, hard edges of the Alpha King had been softened. The wild, fearful defiance of the runaway had been replaced by a calm, quiet strength. Roric spoke to his people. His voice was not the booming command of a tyrant, but the steady, resonant voice of a true leader. He spoke of their losses, honoring the fallen by name. He spoke of their victory, praising the courage of his warriors. Then he turned to Cora, his golden eyes filled with a love and reverence that every wolf in the hall could feel. "We survived because of our strength," he said, his voice echoing in the hall. "But we were victorious because of her. When our hope was lost, she became our hope. When our pack was broken, she made us whole. It was her magic that was our shield, and her heart that was our banner." Darius stepped forward. He was not carrying one crown, but two. One was Roric's old crown, a heavy, brutal thing of iron and obsidian. The other was new. It was a delicate circlet of polished silver, masterfully crafted to look like woven branches of moonlight, with a single glowing moonstone set in the center. Roric took the new crown, and with a tenderness that brought a hush to the hall, he placed it on Cora's head. She was his queen. Then, he did something no one expected. He took his own iron crown, the symbol of his solitary, ruthless power, and he set it aside on a velvet cloth. He would not wear it again. He took Cora's hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and turned back to his people. Darius's voice boomed through the hall. I present to you Roric, Alpha King of the Blackwood, and Cora, Alpha Queen of the Moon. A roar of joyous, deafening approval shook the very stones of the fortress. He had shed the symbol of his tyranny, choosing partnership over power. She had accepted her crown not because she was forced, but because she had chosen her people, her mate, and her home. They were not a king and his prize. They were a kingdom of two ancient bloodlines united by a love that had been forged in fire and betrayal. They looked out at their pack, their hands clasped, their future as bright and hopeful as the coming spring.